So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Jeff McMullen, who's the reason that we're here this morning, and we're going to listen to Jeff talk. So Jeff is make sure I get my notes out here so I get this correct. It's our great pleasure to have you here, Jeff. Jeff is a journalist, author and filmmaker. In his professional life, Jeff has worked extensively writing, filming and campaigning to improve the health, education and human rights of Aboriginal people. His work includes reporting as a foreign correspondent for Four Corners and for 60 Minutes, hosting the 33-part series Difference of Opinion, and hosting a number of televised forums on national Indigenous television. Jeff is going to talk to us this morning about his experience of Aboriginal health, the pattern of health challenge that faces Aboriginal communities, and the careers that can make a difference and improve the health of Aboriginal people at the population level. So just a reminder to people in the audience, this is being live streamed, so if you do want to ask a question or make a comment, if you could just wait for the microphone to come to you. So please join me now in welcoming Jeff.
Thank you for those warm words and good morning everyone. To Auntie Carol, Auntie Bev, Uncle Harold and other elders that have come here this morning, I acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land. And to all of you in the hospital hierarchy who have supported this program, your recognition of culture and of the intellectual knowledge system that is longer than any other that we know about is also very important to develop a broader Australian grasp of truly what well-being is for anyone who lives in this land. What I want to share with you in the hour that we have together this morning is learnings from a life of wandering, but also of deep listening. And those that taught me what really thoughtful listening is were wise Aboriginal elders. People who said, why is it that the smartest men and women that most of us will meet in our life are in fact deep listeners? Every one of the great people that I've met in that 50 years of world wandering, and that includes a Nelson Mandela, it might be a Pope or a Prince or the Dalai Lama or a John Lennon, any of those people was far more interested in finding out what I could share with them than simply showing off their knowledge to me. And it made me understand that the true mark of a healthy and highly intelligent human being is actually that thoughtful listening, because that is how you find the new knowledge that you need to become a bigger mind, a stronger body, a healthier, more active person in the community. So it was the way I was raised in the bush, on the edge of small places that my father and mother lived, and as my brothers and I had a travelling life when we were very young, and my family travelled with Aboriginal families in our life and in our work in all kinds of different ways. So from that deep listening, I could see that the gaps that everyone is focused about now were not traditional. They were not ancient. And that in fact there was a stage in the history of this country, the modern history, only just over 2 centuries ago, where if you looked around the country, the first peoples, in fact, were living with a well-being that was still intact. So I want to ask you at the beginning, why do you think the health pattern changed? What do you think were those terribly disruptive factors that might have changed the well-being that had been there, that even the first people on the fleet, the exploration by the Europeans, all noted how strong men and women were. Cook's journal says these people do not need the trappings of wealth and of the baggage, the stuff that Europeans were dependent on, and how he saw no inequality of condition. He was recognising very late in his whitefella journey up the coast, after looking right through Aboriginal people for a lot of that journey, he was finally seeing that there was something in balance here, that this fellow had grown up rough back in his time in England. He was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was seeing that there was something here in the way people were living that in fact gave them this strength. Does anyone have a suggestion on what would have been a couple of the disruptive factors that unsettled that health? Because I want you to join in the yarning this morning. Any suggestions? Just a one word for what you think it might have been. After those white sails of the First Fleet came on, we know for a start there were gunshots. But it wasn't only the bullet, was it? It was disease, and it was a lifestyle. It was a whole lot of things that accompanied that settlement. Now this leapt out at me when I made a journey into the Amazon with a filmmaker from Four Corners, and we were making some of the world's first television films about the genocide in modern times against the indigenous First Peoples of the Amazon. And what I noticed was Toru, a man that I met up near the top of the Amazon basin near Suriname. Toru, even though we had no language, we had to establish language in a few weeks, share words, point to the sun, the fire, the light, the tree. And he became my instructor. And he was the master of his Amazonian universe. But I saw that he had no idea about the threat that was coming down that Trans-Amazon highway towards him. He had no idea about the deforestation, the disruptive mining, the people that would come for the wealth of that Amazon forest. But he certainly had no inkling also of the disease that was about to decimate his particular tribe, who are called the Zo. And I looked into Toru's family situation and saw us all those years ago. We were all, at some point of our family history, living with a vulnerability to something that was coming down the road towards us. Sometimes the threat is a health threat that we can't easily prepare for because we really have no knowledge of what was coming down the road. Disease decimated the first people of the Amazon. They crashed from somewhere around 5 million when the Portuguese first pushed into that country, and it was the country of those first people, to less than 200,000 today. So if you hear someone say to you in your studies or later in your work, why aren't we all fixated on Indigenous health? What's that got to do with the nation at large? Isn't it the responsibility of those individuals? You point to those global stories, and that's when you see it is all of our responsibility. That if you live here, the well-being of the land, of all the living creatures that are of this land, that Aboriginal sense of custodianship, where every man, woman and child has a shared responsibility. That is why you can say to those people, Aboriginal health is the health of the nation. That if we are going to look to the great society that still lies just ahead of us, we have to work individually and together on trying to bring that well-being to every one of our citizens. And with deep listening and careful thinking, thoughtfulness, and by being reasonable, there is no doubt that we can do this in your lifetime. This is not something to be put off for another century, let alone 2 centuries. We've spent the last 2 centuries largely rupturing, disturbing, breaking that well-being that was there. I know because I've seen the shifts in places in the world where First People have very rapidly, inside of a generation, regained control and addressed the major factors that are undermining the health of those First People. In Australia, clearly, it wasn't only invasion and settlement and theft of the land. It wasn't only the bullet and the massacres. It wasn't only the oppressive policy and the assimilation. And then the relentless refusal to listen to the voices of the First People to actually understand what was required. It wasn't only that it has us in this situation today. The truth is that as a nation, we have not made this personal. We haven't seen the well-being of someone else as important as our own well-being. And in my view, this is what keeps the nation out of balance. The Hopi, one of the First Nations groups in the United States, talks about life out of kilter. And it really means where you can even feel it. You can analyse it and you can measure it and you know all of the gaps. I'm sure you are tired of being told of all of these gaps. But the truth is, older Aboriginal people know something is out of whack. You can walk the country and know that it's out of kilter. So my son and my daughter were with my wife and I in a community one day. And Will, who is now 19, in his second year at university, looked at Claire and said, I know why in this community the kids aren't going to that school, he said, in that school, no one speaks the language of that kid. And Claire chimed in and said, well, not only that, all of the books that they're using are not really in their language. And then they looked around and said to me, you know, it's wrong that in Woogala, this other community, and Manyallaluk down the road, a lot of those kids don't even have an adequate school. So in Manyallaluk, the wheels had fallen off the bus. For 2.5 years, no one fixed the bus. The state, the territory government didn't think those children really would go to school. So for 2.5 years, other than sitting with their parents, those children were in another world, not feeling they were part of a world that has the best education, the best health, the best opportunity of anywhere that I've been as a well-travelled man. What my son and daughter were picking up on, and they were then only probably 5 and 6 years old, what they were seeing was something that is out of balance. And we were wandering on that same trip, and Will met an old fellow named Dickie Minieri, who was a Nunkari. A Nunkari is an Aboriginal doctor, but it's more than that. And Will was fascinated, and he said, well, if everyone's so sick out here, Dickie, why can't you actually make people well again? And they don't even have a chemist shop. They don't have a place that sells nutritious food, but they do have you. Why are people so sick? And the old man explained to Claire and Will what was missing, what was broken, how their control over their actual community, over their families, had been disrupted by all of these invasive factors, how their displacement, being removed and marched off their traditional lands to the remnants of an old cattle station, people who'd never lived together, being thrown together in great poverty, had disrupted their well-being and their balance. And of course, their lifestyle that had nurtured them and made them so strong. All of the observations of the first Europeans remarked on that. And their ability to adapt through all of the changes, the global warming of other eras, the Ice Age, the end of an Ice Age, all of those things in human history here have shown extraordinary resilience and an ability to adapt to massive changes. But what the old Nunkery Dickie was saying to Claire and Will was, we have had nothing as disruptive as this. That was really the message he was trying to get them to see, that it was broken, that their sense of cultural control over their destiny, of respect for who they were, was damaged. And so Will asked Dickie, what's the difference between you, a Nunkery, and a whitefellow doctor? And he said his role was not only to hand out medicine, a prescription, his role was to sort out all of the issues that were under that broken, out of kilter, life out of whack. You might say that's like psychiatry or psychology. In modern medicine, we would branch out into these different fields, but in traditional way of well-being, the discipline was one part of the community structure, but there still had to be responsible people who took on extra burdens. And if you were Dickie, you had to take on the burden of being the counsellor to a whole lot of people. That's a heavy load. But in truth, you can see that many of the people that work in the P and health, in fact, take on a very heavy load. Anyone that works in health has to be very strong, because you are going to be around trauma, loss, grief, pain, disease, struggle. But then you also, like Dickie, through ancient human history, understand that is a gift that you have. If you can be involved in bringing the health, the strength, and easing the pain, and then also guiding people to that control over their health destiny, then it all starts to come together. In truth, whether you're that man in the Amazon with his family, in his case, the threat coming down the road was malaria. Missionaries who wanted to share their Bible and learn the language of every one of these so-called lost tribes had inadvertently carried malaria to the fringe of this area. And malaria, those diseases that we tend to think of the diseases of the third world, the developing world, are in fact massive threats to the whole human family. So malaria, cholera, the new viruses that emerge, if we don't collectively bring our minds and our discipline to see that this is our species, what the old custodians understood is, whether it's HIV/AIDS or Ebola or something new that crawls out of the mutations of viruses, it's not one little tribe's problem. We're a shared family. That's really what a species is. We share the joy and we share the struggle. But when it comes to health, the health of the human family is a challenge that we must make personal. And that's when you bring it home to your own area and you see that in this region, you can have a modern health facility, but how it works out into the community, how it reaches out and identifies where those threats are, whether we stay educated enough, whether we read enough, think deeply enough about this complexity, will determine whether or not we are healthy. Individually, we can't do it all, but if we build the knowledge of the threat, you in fact can see a very ancient pattern. Well-being's not usually an accident. It's a consequence of the lifestyle of that particular group and whether they are able to avoid some of the major threats. If you look back through the longer timelines of Aboriginal health, you realise that what one clever fellow, Jared Diamond, described as the world's greatest human mistake was farming. Not because of what they were growing, but because once you rounded those huge numbers of people up into that kind of sedentary settlement, you in fact made humans vulnerable to the communicable diseases. In traditional life of the first people, that was a threat that was largely avoided. There were other threats to deal with, but this is where our adaptation to the threat is most important. You need knowledge to understand what that threat is, and you don't automatically get that knowledge. You've got to do the work to find out what those threats are. If you look at all of the biggest threatening factors that currently are the frontline challenges in Aboriginal health, you can see collectively a lot of them were either misunderstood, not diagnosed, or certainly neglected for far too long. Because we have in some communities that I work with, mainly the remote small communities, illnesses and diseases that were eliminated here in Penrith over 30 years ago. So I still see in my work acute rheumatic heart fever among infants, and it is extremely rare to have that challenge anymore in an urban Australian area. And we have other unrecognised challenges, things we vaguely know about, but why I say they're unrecognised, we haven't really shaped a national strategy to meet them. Occasionally, a brilliant health leader will come along, an individual who builds a team, and suddenly we shine the light on what could be a life-changing challenge, a moment where we actually get enough unity to deal with one of those health threats. So if you ask who has made a real impact on Aboriginal health in the last 50 years, most people will tell you they won't name a surgeon, they won't name a researcher, they'll name an activist doctor who went out into the bush, and Fred Hollows was focused on eyes. But I have to say, having travelled with him, having watched his work, Fred's main conviction was you can't just do eyes or be concerned about eyes. You've got to see the whole child, all of the health issues surrounding that individual. And so many of them he understood were to do with the poverty of the circumstances of where that individual had grown up. Just last week, I went to a gathering of specialists who were focused on what is probably a far more threatening and in the long term, much more serious challenge than trachoma. And this is the hearing loss that occurs. We have in Australia, among young Australians, the worst hearing loss, especially among Indigenous young people, of anywhere in the developed world. So you have to ask why, when we have close to the best life expectancy and health and balance for most of our young people across the country, why are there these pockets where children from the youngest age cannot hear? They lose so much hearing that they will never, like you, get to the same point of schooling that you're at. Because almost from the time that they are on their mother's breast, quite possibly, doctors tell me at Darwin Hospital, while they're in hospital with their mother, the bacteria, the bugs, have crawled out of the mother's ear canal and into that tiny little baby's ear at such an early stage, even before that child is carried home to a house that is neglected by government, unserviced, that may have 20 to 30 people living on mattresses side by side, where every person is ripe, vulnerable for those diseases of poverty. But in this case, this starts soon after that child is born, in the first 6 months of that baby's life. Otitis media, which is glue ear, as most people know, develops in that little baby. And without the early treatment and without a shift in the circumstances that that baby will go home to live in, the truth is that learning disability is so profound, it will shape the whole journey of that little boy or girl. It will very likely be the child who struggles at school. It is certainly the child who's going to be difficult. And you will find mothers will tell you, I just don't know what it is with that boy or girl. Emotionally, they often don't have the relationship with their mum and dad or their uncles and aunties, because the truth is life is out of balance for that little human being. That's another part of this life out of kilter. If you can't hear and you are really studying everyone to lip read, you are not hearing all you need to know to navigate all of the difficult roads that growing up involve. And so that child struggles all the way to find out really what he or she needs to know. It may be an uncanny coincidence, but when I found out, visiting Aboriginal people in prison, that about the same percentage of them in prison had that profound hearing loss as those that were being measured in school, I saw there is a very serious challenge here that we have neglected. It may be a coincidence, but I don't think it is. There is a pattern. I have gone to court with Aboriginal people to plead with the judge to not put a young man away in Berrima prison for 14 years for severe bodily harm, grievous assault, after a fight in Katherine. And what I had to try to explain is this boy had not only lost both parents recently, he'd not only had one night of rage on the wrong chemical substance, in this case it was very likely ice, but this young man had never been able to really adequately learn because he was just one of dozens that I knew in his village who could never really understand their peer group, let alone a teacher speaking a different language standing at the front of a classroom. And I know there are aids, there are amplifiers, there are little microphones, there are implants, there are operations that you can do on that child to try to remedy this particular disability. But the point is, it is one that started in infancy. That baby is almost born then with this tombstone epitaph. You know, that's the gap. That the minute the child is born, they're saying, see, you're going to have a longer life, less life expectancy. You're going to have all of these chronic illnesses in far more proportions. Well, what I'm saying to you is, no, these are not Aboriginal diseases. This is not a black epidemic. That is a ridiculous, unscientific approach to what is a health issue. And health is about control and knowledge and collective action. If you go to a refugee camp or into a war zone, you will see there's a huge sadness. It's the trauma of everything that has happened around them. And the people have a paralysing inability to act, even when they have a little knowledge about what it is they should be moving towards. And it's not a bad metaphor for what this nation has allowed to happen here in Australia. We have allowed a large number of people, whole communities and regions, suburbs that are simply neglected for so long that it becomes far more difficult to take those steps towards well-being. So if you are going to make your own individual plan to find the knowledge, take steps yourself individually, and then work with others to restore the well-being, you do have to know your story. You've got to know those longer timelines of history. You've got to be confident in knowing who you are. And you've probably got to do some deep thinking about, why are you here? I mean, that's an enormous question. Why are you here on Earth? Why were you born? What is your purpose? And if you believe, as I do, and I believe this because the evidence tells me this is so, if you believe that we are the sentient species. We are the custodians. If you believe that ancient knowledge of the first peoples developed and stayed intact for longer than anywhere else in human society, then you can begin to see your role to be a full human being, a conscious, awake to the challenges, responsible, disciplined. You need strength. You need mental and physical strength. And then you need to see it's not really all about you. It's about the connectedness. And that some of your deepest happiness will come in what you share of that knowledge that you develop. I can tell you, as a mother and father, my wife just flew home today, having been nursing her mother. The minute she walked in the front door, we hugged and then said goodbye, and my children hugged. And as I watched my family this morning, I can tell you there is no greater joy than giving to others in your family. And that ancient understanding of that, of family and community, and then a bigger responsibility to the connectedness of all people in the human family, that is what health is really all about. Well-being is restoring the connectedness, all of the different broken channels. And then you realise it's miraculous that we are here. As far as we know, it's the only little spinning planet that has life like we see around us. So when you've begun to see the bigger pattern, you can then see perhaps a role that you might take up. Really, what I'm doing, what I have done for all of my professional years, is no different to the old traditional storyteller's role in a community. But in traditional Aboriginal life, there were lots of chosen and appointed roles, but they all involved a responsibility. You could be the diplomat. You could be the hunter. You might be the one that was disciplining the younger children. Beautiful word that they have up north, rappery. That's a Yolngu word. It doesn't mean discipline that if you defy that you will be punished. It means to really be a full little human being. This is your given responsibility. So it grows the child up to the sense of discipline, which is quite different to saying, if you don't do this, I'm going to. That's the cause of so many of the problems in the world that you can see. That knee-jerk response to the violence, which often comes out of situations where people are so traumatised, they've forgotten that loving moment that I described this morning. Or they've forgotten what it is like to see a grandmother, a grandfather sitting by the campfire or around the kitchen table in your home, and you hear the wisdom of some old person that finds the right words, like Dickie the old nunkery, to sort out the problem. What's really going on? Why is the kid not going to school or smoking dope or bought a bag of ice? You know, what really is the problem? It's often not the thing that we see up front. It's seeing the magic that happens of counselling. That's what counselling is. Those of you who might go to work as counsellors, you become experts in that deep listening. You actually identify in the behaviour and the facts shared, and in your keen knowledge and your eagerness to see that person regain the control and to start thinking clearly again, you are able to recognise the little warning signs when things are out of whack. When we don't hear those voices, it's because we become a bit numb. We start to accept things that we know are terribly wrong around us, like children, babies with neglected hearing loss, who grow up into adults with neglected hearing loss. We tune out We become a bit numb to it. We see it as about someone else because your hearing is fine. Your speech is fine. You're healthy. You haven't got one of these chronic illnesses that is going to cut people down with that terrible early premature death. So staying awake and connected means the knowledge that you build up has to be active. It's not theoretical learning that you will do. What you're learning at school is not for merely the exercise of your mind. It really is about life skill knowledge, the knowledge that makes you a stronger, smarter human being, and the knowledge that lifts you out of that pure self-interest. And then you start to see it actually restores well-being to you. It can build stronger well-being in those around you. It can help you take care, even while you're still studying, of peers who are in trouble. And it can make you share in what the old people always understood about family, community, and the well-being of all things. Your generation, I know, hears constantly the rather unsettling, challenging declaration that you won't live as long as your parents. I'm troubled by people that have turned that into a mantra, because really it simply isn't true. Because while we have lifestyle illnesses, the global epidemics that do threaten the health of not only individuals, but in some cases whole nations, sometimes whole continents that are facing that threat. But the truth is, you are actually born into a generation with the greatest access to knowledge in human history. Individually, you can access more knowledge than any of your parents, earlier generations, in fact, with great difficulty, had to come to what you can access even on your own. Even allowing for the change in opportunities, the truth is, you are poised to be the healthiest generation. And don't buy the rhetoric about people being born black and then inheriting this gap. That is not borne out by any of the real scientific evidence. It's a collective measurement of our nation's apathy that we have allowed First Peoples to endure somehow the poverty and the oppressive policy that has kept things so out of kilter. The well-being steps, though, you will have to lead. You know, if you wait for the nation at large and the government, federal or state or territory, to show the lead on these issues, you are in fact delaying what you already instinctively, in the very fact that you are thinking about careers in well-being, in health, in this area of science and knowledge, you are delaying using that knowledge. Because I guarantee you, before you're out of school and then before you've finished your further studies, you will come across a personal test or 2 or 3 of them. And it will largely be a case of, are you really listening? Are you hearing that person, young or old? And what are you going to do? Do you have, like Dickie, do you have the heart to be able to take on some of the burden of listening and then finding out what it is that you could share to actually restore the well-being to that person? In the community that I live in, a young man in less than a week ago ended his life. The great tragedy of this, while it is part of a contagion of depression that is sweeping a country where it would seem most young people have more than most others do in other parts of the world, but that depression had expressed itself. This young man had spoken to some of his mates, to his parents. He had said several times, I'm thinking about ending my life. He had attempted to end his life. And yet, it seems that no one actually listened in the way that led to action to connect that young man with the counselling, the deep listening, the support and the treatment that would have kept that human being alive. I've been working with a great Aboriginal psychologist, Pat Dudgeon, who's a Noongar from Perth, and Dr. Tom Calmer, you would know, used to be the Human Rights Commission, the Social Justice and Racial Discrimination Commissioner. Tom and Pat are convinced that the epidemic of Indigenous suicide, which intriguingly did not exist when I was your age, I can guarantee you that. It was so statistically low, no one even mentioned it. It was not a traditional practice. It was not a recourse to pain or sorrow that Aboriginal people took, very interestingly. This has come in the same avalanche of other chronic illnesses and debilitating illnesses, life-threatening illnesses. This condition of mental disorientation, alienation, anxiety, depression, the full spectrum of that kind of pain is in fact gathering force. It's fueled by a whole lot of substances that you already have an excellent education in high school about. I call them the white man's poisons. Now, I'm a white fella, I can say that, but they are. Sometimes to name it, what it is coming down the road, you might not fully understand what this stuff is going to do to someone. But when you see where it fits into history, you'll recognise it. Because so many of those health threats, even if we haven't tried it, are in fact part of a historical pattern. I can think of the connection between tobacco and slavery. And once you see that it's not the plant or even the traditional use of the plant, it's the fact that the plant became the export that required slave labour. So people were actually taken from their homes, from their country, in manacles and put on ships and put to work as slaves in plantations across the world. And the inheritance of slavery is the racism and disunity that you see in those countries. Back home, where that white man's poison was first developed, you'll see the impact in those impoverished countries. Where the slaves once lived before, when they were free men and women, you will find the poorest, least developed countries in Africa. So I say, forget the punitive, don't smoke. Go to the history. You can easily find the science and know that cancer kills. I watched my father die of lung cancer, 62, nearly 63. I love my father. The fact that he smoked as a hard-living Air Force man all of his life was the same way that they lined up the schooners of alcohol on the bar. They are the white man's poisons. Grog is a white man's poison. Alcohol is a poison. And it's not that you can't socially restrain yourself of the use of that poison and have a relaxing social drink. It's when you see the pattern and you see how much of the depression that leads to the premature death of young people, like the young fellow that I've spoken about who's only just ended his life, so much of that depression is made so much worse by what you add to that overwhelming sense of sadness and sorrow, of hopelessness. Because alcohol, marijuana, those particular commonly used and abused white man's poisons are in fact feeding your sense that nothing is worth it. You can't put yourself back together again. That young man actually told his parents, "I'm thinking about killing myself." The other white man's poisons, sugar, is a big part of the global obesity story in terms of what is in the cocktail What is in the cocktail of our food that now leads to the blowout in heart disease, all of that connected pattern of diabetes and renal illness? If you look deeply into where people lived more traditionally with traditional diet, we didn't have those things on the table in that part of human history. It wasn't actually a white fella's poison in the beginning. When the black fellas in Papua New Guinea, I think, were the first people to cultivate sugar. But like the slavery trade built on tobacco, you will see that sugar became another one of those exports cultivated in plantations, also connected to slave labour. And in our own sorry history, we know over 60 or 70,000 possibly people of South Sea Islander heritage were our slaves. We conveniently call them in Australian history indentured labour. They were given dud contracts and put on boats and taken off to the sugar plantations and used as cheap manual labour. When the White Australia policy was passed, we conveniently exported or deported them back to where they came from. About 15,000 of them died in the first 18 months of living in this country because of the poverty.
Your attention please, there'll be a test of the fire evacuation. Please disregard all alarms. This is a test only.
Must be something I said. That loss of 15,000 lives tells you how rough our slaves were living. And all these years later, the leaders of the South Sea Islander community that are often intermarried with people from the Torres Strait and the First Peoples of this land now, the smaller number that stayed are very intermarried, multicultural kind of families, but they are still battling to regain the control over their story. You know, that whole sense of, who am I? Where do I belong? What is the land that sings to me and where I feel like a whole human being? That sense of connectedness was broken in such a cruel way that even today you will see a sadness among many of those old people. This is such a near-term memory for them that they carry the pain of having this torn away from them. That's another kind of mental disturbance that is hard for white fellas to understand. It is hard for us to put into words what that is. When I heard our Prime Minister yesterday, a Prime Minister who's declared that he will be the Prime Minister for Indigenous Affairs, when he said that for people to live on country in the remote communities was a lifestyle choice, he actually revealed a profound ignorance, a very insulting ignorance, because he was looking at a map like an economic rationalist, thinking budgets, how can we afford this service or that service? But the insult was to say this was a lifestyle choice. For people of country, whether you're the torn up South Sea Islander who's been dragged from Vanuatu to cut cane as a slave, or whether you've been marched around the country like this nation has done to the First Peoples for over 2 centuries, we are still tearing people away from country. And that is like taking the mind or a piece of the mind out of that human being. You have that same feeling. It's not about suburban and remote, because I dare say you feel that in special places. Even when you have a yearning to connect to where your elders and your ancestors were fully in control, where they lived and breathed the stories that came up through millennia on that particular place. I know you can sense what I'm talking about. You could hear the Crimson Rosella sing here in Western Sydney one morning. You hear that beautiful, clear bird. Or it might be the smell of a piece of bush. Or my son has an expression, Will, where he says, when there's a certain gleam on the water of the sea, and he says, these are the dolphin days. You mightn't see the dolphin, but everything seems in balance on that day, and you feel it's good to be a human being. The connectedness to country is felt by farmers who don't want their land torn apart by fracking. This is not an environmental sermon. It is showing you the parallels between the most ancient custodianship and the most brilliant modern earth science. Among my greatest heroes in this world are in those two streams of human knowledge. The ancients who understood and gave us the foundations of what now we know how to measure and we have words for it, but a lot of the real wisdom in human history was lived and practiced and was handed on in an oral form before it was ever put into books or onto digital age slabs or into the cloud. It is in the work of Bill Gammage, a great Australian scientist who's written a book called The Greatest Estate on Earth, talking about an era when life in this land was in balance. I really recommend that book to you before you do years and years of other study, and are perhaps fed by our sometimes authoritarian universities a certain slant on history. It's good to check and test and explore widely, because some of the white fellows who've written those books have left out an awful lot in their early work. When I was going to university, you had historians of the left and the right who very rarely ever gave you what they called prehistory. It's not prehistory, it's the longer timeline. And you have in your longer timeline incredible strengths. You've got to discover that knowledge, and you can find it in books written by First Peoples and by others, which is why I mentioned the Bill Gammage book. To understand the structures, the discipline, the prizing of human knowledge, the engineering, the skills of living in one of the most difficult continents on Earth through extraordinary change will make you proud, but it'll make you strong, because I'm sure you will come to the conclusion that the things that we've been talking about here this morning are all challenges that we can meet. Compared with the climatic changes that would have hit this continent at the end of an ice age, anything that we are facing today, with all of the technology and wealth that this nation has, should seem fairly simple. I don't see a health challenge that we can't respond to. It is not on the scale of a whole continent where people for centuries have been controlled and oppressed, destroyed in many cases. We, because of the inheritance that the ancient societies here gave us, we actually have the makings of the healthiest place on earth. You can shape that. You can be part of building the greatest human society that ever lived in human history. Because from ancient times, we understand diversity, the scientific principle of why diversity is so important in the well-being of a species. Diversity really is about shades of human creativity. So instead of thinking of difference as something threatening, actually think of it as ways of seeing the world, therefore ways of solving problems. And if you bring that knowledge together, that's what comes from deep listening. You have a richer, fuller, stronger human being, a much smarter human being. Diversity is an important biological scientific principle, but the ancient people here understood that. There was not one ancient First Peoples culture. There were hundreds of vibrant cultures. And I've heard people try to criticise this. Geoffrey Blaney, one of those old historians of the right that I said in my university days, never gave me a book to read that dealt with much of what I've discovered of 50 years of trying to explore and read myself into this. Geoffrey Blaney made a disparaging comment in which he was arguing that the small groups of Aboriginal people were never big enough to be threatening to anyone very much. And he missed the point that the otherwise old writer, Bill Gammage, had been making. Societies were organised in tune with this living environment. They responded. The resilience factor, in fact, necessitated a flexibility, and that people lived in different ways in different parts of the country. They were physiologically different, just as now, if you think of who we call First People, and we even use those words of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, it doesn't do justice to the diversity. So hundreds of cultures, hundreds of languages, in ancient times is the foundation for our modern, future, healthy nation that we're going to build. Because whether it's the Sudanese child who arrives as a refugee, or whether it's the child that is neglected, born on the mother's breast in remote Australia, with the one that will experience the hearing loss, the one that will be told you're going to have all of these gaps in your achievement and then a gap in your life expectancy, it doesn't matter how you got here. The wisdom of the ancients is to see it's our well-being as a human family. It's each one of us. So you can see either of those children as your children, a little sister, a little brother. They are equally your responsibility. I know that with my own children. Having travelled with them from the youngest age, once they see what is right or wrong and where they can act, they become responsible. They will find in their own mind and heart a way to contribute to the well-being of others. And they constantly challenge me to be doing far more. Because the older or the more programmed you are in your thinking, often the less likely you are to change yourself, to act in a different way that might bring the change, the well-being that is required for our nation. If you get old and complacent, you can say, like a lot of the politicians do, those people need to change their lifestyle. Well, isn't that interesting? Because there in the federal parliament, you will find people who demonstrate why we have a national social drinking problem, where they will even go back into parliament truly unable to think straight. And you'll hear it in the argumentative hollering at one another, the disrespect that is shown in the behaviour. That's not much of an example for the rest of us. But the truth is, in every profession, even those with the knowledge, you still have to personally and collectively use that knowledge to get to the well-being. Intriguingly, Aboriginal doctors I work with pointed this out to me. Young people studying medicine at university have very high levels of anxiety and depression. But on the other hand, doctors and nurses have a great understanding and individual control over issues like smoking and use of alcohol. But it doesn't save the doctor who may be overworked in his practice or her practice. It doesn't save that doctor necessarily from the anxiety and depression and the conditions that come from stress. So you can have the knowledge and still watch life become out of balance. So what is it that gets you to that point where it comes back into balance? It's actually a reasonableness. It's also understanding how we've evolved as human beings. How are we meant to live? It's why I said it's a profound question, and yet it's one every child asks at one point. Why am I here? Will said to me, what will come after people? when he was about 5 years old, because he could see we may not always be here, but while we are, it appears we are the custodians, the sentient ones. But are we using the knowledge? The balance is about understanding that ancient people were not less intelligent than we are. It was a different era. It was a different part of that long timeline. Ancient people loved or hated. They cooperated or they fought. They lived well or they lived badly and died. All of those things are there in the longer timelines. But what you can see is what brought wellness to societies, whether they were settled as farming communities or whether they were wandering and then, as Babbage talks about it, cultivating the estate. What brought the well-being together? And some of it, I will say, is so simple, it leaps out at you when you actually travel the world, and you'll see that human creativity, the problem solving in different ways in different regions. Some of the simpler things are so close, and yet in modern life we ignore them. We sit most of the day. We were born to move, to walk. Every Aboriginal people will tell you, or up in the Torres Strait, they will tell you, you've got to get down to the edge of the water. You've got to get onto the sea in a boat. That's an ancient impulse. We were meant to move. And therefore, you have to get out of the chair and you have to do the things that make you feel good. So it can be going down to the sea. It can be wandering in the bush. It can be doing some work. It could be growing something. If you watch societies that have their little gardens, there is nothing more pleasing than see a seed that you planted shoot, grow, and then help sustain your family. But that's all moving. If you are sedentary, you almost guarantee that you will have some of the issues earlier in your life that you could deal with by moving. But you've got to move to the knowledge, and you've got to take action with the knowledge that you find. I'm not saying you should spend every day of your life pumping iron or running around the track. It's not that. It's about understanding physiologically, physically and mentally, what gives you that feeling of well-being. For those people who've thought about ending their life like that young man, I knew a great psychologist who would discuss with that individual, here's a list of 100 things. Find something on that list that makes you want to move, makes you feel good, gives you that sense of you're in control of your destiny. And the man told me that sometimes the young person wouldn't see a single thing on the list. I looked at them, and in truth, every one of them sounded pretty good to me. They were very simple, obvious things, like going to a movie, going to hear music, being with your friends, playing a sport that you loved, getting in the water, having a surf, all of those things, and the delight in company of other human beings. The point is that knowledge still requires somebody who can bring those individuals to act on the knowledge. That's the special gift. If you work in medicine, a lot of people will not take it on like the load that Dickie Mintinieri took on. He had a whole community of health and worries, sorry business, you know, the endless funerals. Dickie shouldered all of that. And I see it in the nurses, I see it in the doctors, I see it in the brilliant surgeons and the researchers. It is a load. But the gift also gives you the capacity yourself to grow as a human being, and it lifts you out of self-interest in such a way that sharing that is the greatest gift that you can offer. It is, in a way, a simple expression of the love that you have for your fellow human beings. When you have your own children, perhaps, you will see it's an instinct. But if you don't act on it, and if you pretend that work is more important, or I'm busy, I'm sorry, kid, you miss out on that. That's where family, community, and this bigger sense of the human family are part of taking the steps to well-being. The knowledge to eliminate the white poisons, you need to update that constantly. There's always a new bag of something that is largely going to be bad for you. Whether you need it or not will depend on your mental state, because you'll convince yourself sometimes, I'm feeling so bad, I'll have another one. It doesn't change. The truth is, the exuberance, the high, exhilaration, all of the words that people put on the feelings they try to get from that kind of chemical injection are pretty short-lived, are very often addictive, but they don't connect you to how we have lived as human beings, how we have evolved, what our body and mind really requires for well-being. Those things you can find out, and you can use them in sharing a power that you will have with others. It is an enormous power to be able to contribute to the well-being of all living things around you. And you'll find it brings out something in you, in your intellect and in your heart. It will help you develop a value system that ultimately is the thing that determines whether you're healthy or not. I've seen people in the war zone, in the refugee camp, and in very oppressed, remote Aboriginal communities where they have been given no help. And some people find these strengths, this shared concern for others. Why is it that the poorest people that I met in my life were the first to offer myself and my film crews help, shelter, food? Even in Rwanda, in the midst of that genocide, when close to 1 million people, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed in less than 30 days. There, people went out of their way to stop us being killed, and went out of their way to share the food that they had. And I saw people who were meant to be enemies display that concern for the well-being of those that were being oppressed. So I don't think we are programmed for the kind of clash of civilizations that dooms our species. We have a choice. In health, the choice that you make to work in health is, in my view, this is an Aboriginal perspective, about custodianship and the future of our species. It's not only about our individual health, it's, are we going to grow a human species that can overcome the challenges that we can name and identify very clearly now? And can we create the sense of well-being for everyone? I believe we can. And when you hear the country sing to you, when you have that strong feeling of, I feel better when I'm moving down this road, then you understand all of those beautiful things that are expressed in Auntie Carol's Welcome to Country. You remember, we are never the first, and we're not alone. In my lifetime here, I happen to have had the joy of meeting the first Aboriginal nurse, Sally Gould, a handful of the first Aboriginal doctors, but Helen Milroy, who's a Noongar, was the first. And then we have from this state, Dr. Kelvin Kong and his two sisters, Marlene and Marilyn, 3 Aboriginal doctors, including the surgeon, in one family. It was an extraordinary accomplishment. I mean, that's a story everyone should know. He should be on postage stamps or banknotes. There are so many stories to celebrate, but they are the pioneers. You are poised in your generation to make the change and to see the well-being of the nation restored. We're closer to it than anywhere else on earth. But if we make it personal and then we work together, we will see it happen. You know, in your lifetime, you could see this nation have not only the best life expectancy, but well-being, where people care and look after one another as family and as community. Those are Aboriginal values. Thank you very much.